Good afternoon, my friends. It's lovely to have you back. So today we're going to look at the provisions mechanic in Gwent Homecoming. When building a deck in Homecoming, there will be a provision cap. This is the maximum amount of provisions you can use to build a deck. Adding cards to the deck uses provisions, and to build a complete deck, you currently need to have 30 cards in the deck and be under the provision cap. Now, provisions are a numerical value assigned to every card, and in this sense, they're used as a secondary balancing mechanic. While a card has strength and/or abilities, which are used to govern its value, we also now have to take into account how many provisions it costs to add that card to the deck. For example, a card which has 10 value when played, which costs 5 provisions, might be a very good card. The same card, at the cost of 25 provisions, will be a lot worse. So what we'll see when Homecoming is released is some cards will be deemed good based on their provision to value ratio. By adding this provision system into the game, it allows CD Projekt Red to keep a card's played value while still making it more or less expensive to put into the deck, balancing it in some form. This could be very important for cards which require balancing, but by altering the card's strength hinders its synergy down the line. For example, let's say they wanted to lower a unit's strength because it's too much value, like the operator, but in doing so drops it below the common Alzor's double cross reach. By making the operator more expensive to put into the deck via provisions, you still keep the Alzor's double cross synergy, but the value loss comes from elsewhere in the deck, as you would have to choose lower provision valued cards to compensate. And in this sense, the provision mechanic is aiming to balance decks across the game in this regard. And whilst this gives a very simplistic outlook on provisions, we know it won't boil down to anything as basic as this, due to the other mechanics which are in the game. Synergies versus removal, setup versus power plays, carryover versus tempo. The next topic that provisions highlights is the mid-provisions decks versus the extreme provision decks. If I have a high value card that was more expensive to add to the deck due to provisions, I should be able to beat a weaker card that was cheaper to add to the deck. But what if I don't draw my high value card? With an increased deck size of 30 cards currently, and tutoring being lessened in Homecoming, it stands to reason that thinning to 0 cards will not be as easy as it currently is. A mid-provision deck will use cards of average provisions and have a generally strong deck across the board, whereas an extreme provision deck will use many high-value, expensive provision cards and counter those with cheap, weak cards to fill up the minimum card criteria. Their aim being to mulligan, discard or thin through the cheap cards and play only the more powerful cards in their deck. It was rumoured that a Saskia Blaze style card still remains in Homecoming, banishing cards from the hand and drawing equal to the amount banished. A card like this would enable extreme provision decks easily using an anti-mulligan method, where you keep the worst cards in hand and banish them on turn 1. To complement this style of play, we now know that leaders have different mulligan values, that those mulligans are game-based and not round-based, meaning that you get to keep your mulligans for the entirety of the game if you haven't used them, and that leaders get extra mulligans if they go first within a game. Choosing a high mulligan leader and a leader like Francesca, which could guarantee Saskia Blaze in round 1, should make for a more consistent approach to these types of decks. And finally, why should provisions be restricted to the deck builder? With the added element of balancing that it brings, provisions can be used on card abilities to balance said abilities. Some examples of this: tutor any special card of 4 provisions or less. This allows tutors to exist and balances their value based on what they can pull. There isn't a chance that later on down the road we'll get a high value organic spell that is made and disrupts the tutor's value. Another example is when X provisions are on the battlefield, summon this card. This could influence the deck building to get high provisions onto the board as fast as possible. If they did intend to use provisions during gameplay, they would need to provide the provision cost of each card on the information screen. So I think it is clear to say that provisions will provide a large part to deck building as well as game balance. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more Gwent videos and have yourself a pleasant evening. Goodbye.